Jerry Lewis wasn't just a comedian. He was a force of nature, loud, brilliant, unpredictable, and sometimes completely unbearable. On stage, he could make America laugh until it cried. But backstage, that was a different story, because when Jerry Lewis walked onto The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the energy in the studio changed. He wasn't just another guest. He was a legend who demanded attention. He'd talk over the host, roast the other guests, and push his wild brand of comedy past everyone's comfort zone. Some nights it worked. Carson would grin, the audience would cheer, and it was magic. But other nights, you could almost feel the tension through the screen. The fake smiles, the awkward silences, and the unspoken thought every celebrity in that room seemed to share. I can't stand this guy. Because for all his genius, Jerry Lewis had one fatal flaw. He couldn't help but dominate the room. And on a set like Carson's, that was dangerous. You didn't step on the king of late night. You didn't steal his spotlight. And you definitely didn't humiliate the guests sitting next to you. Over the years, The Tonight Show became the stage for some of the most uncomfortable moments in Jerry's long career. Moments where you could see the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. The cold stares, the forced laughter, and the quiet decision that certain stars made the second the cameras cut. Never again. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on 5 famous faces who couldn't stand Jerry Lewis. 5 moments of real, on-air hostility that Johnny Carson's audience will never forget. From comedians who refused to laugh at his jokes, to legends who openly clashed with him in front of millions. Each story reveals a side of Jerry the public rarely saw. The arrogant showman, the difficult collaborator, and the man who turned one of television's most beloved stages into his personal battlefield. And trust me, by the end of this list, you'll understand exactly why so many stars swore they'd never sit next to Jerry Lewis again. When you think of The Tonight Show, you probably picture smooth charm, effortless comedy, and that perfect balance between host and guest. But the night Jerry Lewis sat across from master impressionist Rich Little, that balance completely shattered. At first, everything seemed fine. Rich Little, known for his uncanny ability to mimic anyone from Frank Sinatra to Johnny Carson himself, was supposed to be the light-hearted guest that night. But the moment Jerry Lewis walked on stage, it stopped being friendly television and started feeling like a duel. Now Jerry had this reputation. He loved being the loudest, funniest person in the room. And Rich? He was quiet, precise, a craftsman of comedy timing. 2 completely different energies. So when Jerry started interrupting Rich's impressions, making faces, and jumping in with his own exaggerated versions, the crowd laughed. But Rich didn't. One audience member later said you could feel the irritation in the room. Every time Rich tried to finish a sentence, Jerry cut him off. Every setup turned into Jerry's punchline. It wasn't collaboration, it was sabotage. Johnny Carson tried to keep things smooth, tossing jokes to break the tension. But Jerry was relentless. Laughing over Rich, poking fun at his stiff delivery, and even mocking Carson's voice mid-impression. At one point, Rich leaned back, smiled politely, and said, "Well, I guess I'll just let Jerry do all my material for me." The crowd laughed nervously, but that wasn't a joke. That was frustration. Backstage, people who worked on The Tonight Show later recalled that Rich Little didn't hide his feelings afterward. He was polite but cold. Someone asked him what he thought of the segment, and he reportedly said, "Jerry's a funny guy. If you give him a script that's all about Jerry." That line pretty much summed it up. Rich Little spent his career perfecting other people's voices. But that night, he realized there was only one voice Jerry Lewis wanted to hear, his own. Afterward, Rich's appearances alongside Lewis quietly stopped. And while both men stayed active in the comedy scene, insiders say they avoided each other for decades. For Rich, it wasn't worth the chaos. For Jerry, he probably never noticed, because in his mind, he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd stolen the show. But to Johnny Carson's crew, it was just another night where Jerry proved one thing. When he came on stage, no one, not even a world-class impressionist, could compete with his ego. By the early 1980s, Jerry Lewis was Hollywood royalty, a living legend who'd seen it all. But when he appeared on The Tonight Show alongside Bill Cosby, it wasn't the laugh riot anyone expected. In fact, it was one of the most uncomfortable nights in late-night history. It was 1982, and Bill Cosby wasn't just a household name. He was one of the few comedians who could rival Jerry's fame. That alone was enough to create tension. Two egos, two eras, one stage. And that night, the atmosphere in the studio felt heavy. Jerry was his usual whirlwind self, loud, animated, constantly interrupting the flow of the show. He cracked jokes at lightning speed, mugged for the audience, and turned every moment into a performance. But when he looked to Cosby for a reaction, nothing. Not even a smirk. Cosby sat there, stone-faced, arms crossed, watching Jerry like a teacher letting a student dig their own grave. At first, people thought it was a bit two comedy legends doing some kind of planned routine, but it wasn't. This was real tension. Jerry would crack a joke, throw himself into one of his famous over-the-top faces, and Cosby would just say flatly, "You done?" The crowd laughed nervously, unsure if it was part of the act. But you could see Jerry getting uncomfortable. For a man who thrived on laughter, silence was the one thing he couldn't handle. Backstage sources later said that before the taping, Jerry had come in acting like he owned the place, giving notes to the crew, suggesting how the interview should go, even joking that he should have been the one guest hosting instead of Cosby. That didn't sit well. Bill Cosby wasn't the kind of guy to bow to someone else's ego, especially not on his night as guest host. So when the cameras rolled, Cosby decided to do what Carson himself rarely did, push back. Every time Jerry tried to take control of the conversation, Cosby cut him off or shifted to a serious topic. When Jerry made one of his trademark exaggerated noises, Cosby stared at him and said, "You know, some people confuse energy with talent." The audience gasped. It wasn't said as a joke. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't two comics playing off each other. This was one legend quietly putting another in his place. After the show, insiders said Jerry was furious. He stormed out before the wrap party, muttering about unprofessionalism. Cosby, on the other hand, was calm, almost smug. When someone asked him what happened, he reportedly said, "Jerry's used to being the smartest man in the room." Not tonight. That episode never aired in reruns. NBC buried it quietly, labeling it awkward energy. But the people who saw it live never forgot, because in that single segment, two of the biggest names in comedy showed exactly how fragile fame can be. Jerry came to reclaim the spotlight. Cosby made sure he never found it. Johnny Carson was the king of late night. Unshakable, effortlessly cool, and respected by everyone who ever sat on that famous couch. Everyone, except maybe Jerry Lewis. Their relationship was complicated. Johnny admired Jerry's genius, sure, his films, his energy, his legacy. But he also understood something that few people dared to say out loud. Jerry Lewis could be exhausting. From the 1960s through the 1980s, Jerry made multiple appearances on The Tonight Show. Some were charming, some were chaotic. But every single one carried that same undercurrent, Johnny's calm professionalism, slowly clashing with Jerry's need to dominate the room. And it all came to a head during one unforgettable night. Jerry came on, supposedly to promote his annual Labor Day telethon. But instead of sticking to the topic, he turned the entire interview into a one-man show. He started doing bits, cutting off Johnny's questions, standing up in the middle of the couch segment to act out stories that no one had set up. The audience was howling, but Johnny wasn't smiling. Behind that famous grin, Carson was fuming. He'd built The Tonight Show on rhythm, an unspoken balance between host and guest. You could be funny, unpredictable, even wild, but you respected the flow. And Jerry? He was wrecking it in real time. At one point, Carson tried to rein him in gently, saying, Jerry, sometimes I feel like you're trying to take my job. The audience laughed. Jerry fired back instantly. Well, someone has to keep the ratings up, Johnny. You could feel the air get sucked out of the room. Carson froze for half a second. That famous polite smile locked in place. And then, as the laughter awkwardly faded, he said, "Well, that's one way to lose an invitation." The crowd laughed again, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. When the cameras cut to commercial, Johnny's expression dropped. According to a longtime stagehand, Carson leaned toward his producer and said quietly, "That's the last time he hijacks my show." And he meant it. For years afterward, Jerry's name didn't come up on the booking list again. Not officially banned, but effectively blacklisted. If a producer mentioned him, Johnny would just shake his head and move on. To the public, they kept it professional. Jerry would occasionally say kind things about Carson in interviews, and Johnny never spoke ill of him. But behind the scenes, everyone knew the damage was done. What made it worse was that Johnny understood Jerry. In some ways, they were mirror images. Perfectionists, control freaks, men who used humor as armor. The difference was that Johnny knew when to step back. Jerry didn't. And that's why this feud hurt more than any other. It wasn't two enemies going at it. It was two legends, both obsessed with control, colliding in the only arena big enough for them both, The Tonight Show stage. By the end of Carson's career, the two never truly made peace. They'd smile for the cameras if they crossed paths, but the warmth was gone. Because when you crossed Johnny Carson, Carson, especially on his own show, there were no second chances. When you put Frank Sinatra and Jerry Lewis in the same room, you didn't just get two stars, you got two worlds colliding. Sinatra was the definition of cool. Calm, confident, never raising his voice unless he meant it. Jerry Lewis, on the other hand, was a hurricane in human form. Funny, loud, unpredictable. On their own, they were icons. But together, it was gasoline and fire. It happened in the early 1970s on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson had booked both men for what NBC thought would be a dream lineup. Two legends from the golden age of show business sharing stories about the old days. But nobody expected what actually went down. From the moment Jerry walked out, he was on. Jumping up, doing impressions, cracking rapid-fire jokes. The crowd was loving it, but Sinatra wasn't. He sat there quietly, hands folded, watching Jerry with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Carson noticed it right away. That smile, it was the same one Frank used when he was annoyed but too classy to say so. Then Jerry made his mistake. He turned toward Sinatra, mid-bit, and said, "Hey, Frank, you ever think about doing something funny once in a while?" The audience gasped, then laughed, thinking it was part of the act. But Frank didn't laugh. He just leaned back, stared at Jerry, and said calmly, "You do the clown stuff, kid. I'll stick to selling records." The studio went silent. Johnny, always the master of live tension, jumped in with a joke. Something about how, at least one of them, was keeping the censors awake. The crowd laughed again, and the show went on. But everyone watching could see the look on Jerry's face. The first flicker of embarrassment, maybe even regret. After the show, crew members said Jerry tried to laugh it off, telling people he was just teasing Frank. But behind the scenes, Sinatra wasn't amused. According to one NBC insider, he told the booking team, "If he's on again, I'm not." And that was that. Jerry's next few invitations quietly disappeared. Sinatra, meanwhile, kept showing up whenever he wanted. no questions asked. It wasn't that Frank hated Jerry, not exactly. It was that Jerry represented everything Sinatra avoided: chaos, noise, insecurity disguised as confidence. Frank liked control. Jerry thrived in the lack of it. In the end, their moment on The Tonight Show became a quiet Hollywood lesson. Even the funniest man in the room can go too far, especially when that room belongs to Frank Sinatra. And after that night, whenever The Tonight Show crew heard Sinatra's name on the booking list, they had one unspoken rule: don't seat him next to Jerry Lewis again. If there's one feud that defined Jerry Lewis's entire life, it was the one he shared with Dean Martin. They weren't just comedy partners. They were the biggest act in America. From nightclubs to box offices, Martin and Lewis were Hollywood in the 1950s. And then suddenly they weren't. Their partnership ended in 1956, a bitter, public breakup that left both men scarred and silent for 20 years. They refused to speak, refused to appear together, and when interviewers brought up the other's name, Dalib Bimasontation, they dodge it like a wound that never healed. So when The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson announced that both Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis would be appearing, separately but in the same episode, the entire entertainment world stopped to watch. Everyone thought it would be a warm reunion, a moment of forgiveness between two old friends. But what they got instead was cold, quiet tension. Dean came out first, suave, laid back, drink in hand, doing his usual effortless charm routine. The audience adored him. Then Carson, with that trademark twinkle in his eye, teased the crowd, "We might have someone else dropping by tonight." Moments later, Jerry Lewis walked out. The place exploded. People were standing, cheering, clapping. But the only person who didn't look thrilled was Dean. He smiled politely, but it wasn't the real Dean Martin smile. It was the kind you put on when you're stuck in a moment you didn't agree to. Jerry ran to hug him, loud, emotional, over the top, like something out of a movie. Dean hugged back, but just barely. It was brief, stiff. On the surface, it looked like a reunion, but up close, you could see it. Years of resentment, pride, and pain that never really went away. Johnny tried to lighten the mood, tossing them easy questions about their old movies and comedy tours. Jerry played it up, reminiscing, cracking jokes, almost begging Dean to loosen up. But Dean stayed calm, detached, almost distant. When Johnny asked if they'd ever work together again, Dean gave that trademark grin and said, "Nah, we already did that once. Didn't work out too bad, did it?" The audience laughed, but Jerry didn't. His smile froze for a split second before he turned it into another joke, but you could tell it stung. That night was supposed to be closure. Instead, it was a reminder that some wounds don't heal, even under studio lights. After the show, insiders said Jerry was emotional backstage. Not angry, but deflated. He told a crew member, "I thought we'd laugh again." Dean, on the other hand, went straight to his dressing room, poured a drink, and reportedly said to a friend, "That chapter's over." They would have a brief public reunion years later, engineered by Frank Sinatra on Jerry's telethon. But even then, it felt more ceremonial than sincere. Their final Tonight Show moment together became legendary. Not for what was said, but for what wasn't. Two men who had once built an empire on laughter, standing just a few feet apart, separated by years of silence, neither could fully break. It was the quietest moment in a room built for comedy, and one of the most human. By the time the lights went down on Johnny Carson's stage for the final time, Jerry Lewis had already become more myth than man. He was the kind of star people either adored or couldn't stand. For some, he was pure brilliance, the restless genius who changed comedy forever. For others, He was a reminder that talent and humility don't always come in the same package. Over the decades, The Tonight Show became more than just a talk show for Jerry. It was a mirror, a place where every side of him showed up. The entertainer, the perfectionist, the provocateur, the friend, the rival, the man who could make America laugh one second and make Hollywood hold its breath the next. Rich Little couldn't handle his interruptions. Bill Cosby froze him out completely. Johnny Carson himself drew the line. Frank Sinatra silenced him with one sentence. And Dean Martin, his greatest partner and greatest loss, left him standing in the kind of silence that no punchline could fill. That was Jerry Lewis. A man too big for his own spotlight. He didn't just appear on The Tonight Show, he tested it, pushed it, bent it until even Johnny Carson, the most unflappable man in television, finally had to say enough. But maybe that's why we still talk about him. Because love him or hate him, Jerry Lewis never faded quietly. He demanded to be remembered. And for better or worse, he got his wish. So, what do you think? Was Jerry Lewis a misunderstood genius or Hollywood's most impossible guest? Drop your thoughts below, and if you love these deep dives into old Hollywood's hidden rivalries, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us next time, where another legend story proves that behind the laughter, there's always a little bit of chaos.